John 18 is where we're going to be today as we continue in the series in John's Gospel. This is what I love about preaching through a book. You know, we will change our schedule a little bit based on Christian holidays, based on Easter and based on Christmas. We will arrange the preaching schedule in those regards. But very rarely do we really modify the preaching schedule when it comes to Hallmark holidays, like Mother's Day and things like that. And so this is why I love to preach through a book, because you know this is the holiday that it's going to fall on, and this text shows up today, and yet it's the sufficiency of God's Word that I think this text is quickly becoming one of my favorite Mother's Day texts. And so let's get into it and see what the Spirit has to say to us today. John 18, beginning in verse number 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. And so he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken, "Of those whom you gave me, I have lost not one." Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into his sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" Hopefully, as we preach through John's gospel over these last 45 weeks, hopefully there have been some themes that have meant something to you, that has confronted you wherever you are in your life. Maybe there's something, a new element, a new aspect of who Jesus is. Maybe a thought that you've had before, but now in this circumstance in your life, it means so much more to you. Something that's really struck me in John's gospel, it's an undercurrent. It's not overtly there in any way, but as we've read these stories, we've noticed this very common theme that Jesus, in the midst of doing the miraculous, Jesus has this attention to detail that you and I simply do not have. He has almost this kind of holy restraint that then allows him in the midst of the big picture moments when everybody else is awed by what he is doing to still have compassion on the smallest of things. And so whenever he works his first miracle at the request of his mother, changing water into wine, in the midst of the bigness of that moment, he still has the holy restraint, the compassion, the thoughtfulness to make sure that nobody else really knew about that miracle, so he didn't take the spotlight away from the bride and groom on their big day. When he feeds the 5,000, Jesus was thoughtful enough to still pick up the scraps to make sure that nothing went to waste. When he raised Lazarus from the dead and everybody was celebrating and amazed at what was going on, Jesus had the thoughtfulness to say, "Hey, somebody might want to remove his burial clothing. He's probably uncomfortable right now." And even in this moment, as he is being arrested, and he is now headed toward the cross, Jesus shows a compassion that is very difficult to understand. And so for these past few chapters, we've seen Jesus now living with his disciples, praying with his disciples. And so in chapter 15, 16, and 17, you kind of get this going away kind of farewell address of Jesus now partly in the upper room speaking and then partly walking through probably the streets of Jerusalem at night. The same night that he had sent Judas out into. And he's giving them kind of this going away speech as he's walking through the city of Jerusalem. And in chapter 18, in verse number 1, the text makes a switch. And he says they left and headed over for the Kidron Valley into a garden. It seems as though that Jesus maybe knew a wealthy person and had made preparations for the week of a place that he and his disciples could stay during this Passover week. So they'd been staying in this garden. Well, for several chapters in John's gospel, the Roman soldiers and the Jewish high leaders, they had been trying to arrest Jesus. The Jewish people wanted to arrest him for heresy. The Romans were more than happy to arrest him for treason. And so they'd been finding a way to arrest him. But they had to do it in a very subtle way. They didn't want to arrest Jesus whenever he was among the crowds. Imagine if they had tried to arrest Jesus when he had just fed 5,000 men. Well, having just had their needs met and supplied, if a small band of soldiers came in to swoop up Jesus, a riot probably would have broken out. And so in a very smart way, they wanted to trap Jesus whenever he was alone. They wanted to get him when it wouldn't make a big foray, a big heyday that was going on to the whole people of what was taking place. They wanted to get him with just this small band of disciples. So they made a deal with Judas. And Judas kind of could see where the tides were going. And Judas began to say, hey, I can show you where he is, where he's staying. So you can swoop in and take him, and you can have him arrested, and you can have him in a safe place before anybody even knows what's going on. And that place was this garden. And so Jesus walks into this garden, and John's gospel does a masterful job at showing that all throughout this, that Jesus knew what was going to take place. This is not something that comes as a shock to him. Situations and circumstances in life shock us. They come out of nowhere to us, but that doesn't happen that way to Jesus. Jesus knows exactly what is going on. And so it doesn't surprise him when this very large band of soldiers begin to make their way. You could probably see the torches coming in the night. The disciples probably their anxiety begin to build. They begin to get afraid, not knowing what was going to take place. And the soldiers suddenly appear to arrest Jesus. But before they can even almost get to the edge, Jesus steps out and he asks them, whom do you seek? Who is it that you're after? And it's interesting in John's gospel that on two different occasions this question is asked. Right here in this passage, Jesus asked them, whom do you seek? And on three different occasions, John gives this response of Jesus that I am he. In part, you have just the literal story of what is going on. But at another part, you have John now writing his gospel, trying to convince us to believe, and he's using these questions as a metaphorical question to now pierce the heart of all of us. Whom do you seek? The soldiers were coming after Jesus, and Jesus wants to say, I am he, but there's something much deeper that's going on, that the world is now seeking for a satisfaction, for a fulfillment, for an identity of who we actually are. We're all seeking after something. We're all seeking after somebody. Maybe we're seeking after a power, a fame, a wealth, a reputation, an identity of some sort. We're all seeking after something. And what Jesus is showing us in this passage is, I am he. That he is the ultimate answer to that fulfillment. That whatever we're seeking fulfillment in is not going to give us a long-lasting satisfaction. Instead, that can only be found in him. But what strikes me in this passage is how Jesus steps out between the soldiers and his disciples. He wants to protect them in this moment. Think about it. He's the one that's about to die. He's the one that's about to suffer. He knows they're coming after him, but he has the grace and the compassion in this moment to shield his disciples. And so he doesn't want them to be confused. He doesn't want them to have to testify to what is going on. He doesn't want them to be caught up in what's about to take place. He wants to do this on his own. It's a tremendous grace that Jesus shows. And he just simply says, whom do you seek? And they say they're seeking Jesus of Nazareth, and Jesus says, I am he. And it's interesting that the first soldiers fall down. John doesn't give any reasoning for that, any answer to that. They fall down almost in the weight of the glory of who he is. They're overwhelmed in the presence of Jesus. You would think in that moment, if you're a soldier on the second line, that you would watch that and you would want to, in that moment, drop your sword and switch sides. But they don't do that. And so he asks again, whom do you seek? And once again, he says, I am he. I am the one that you're coming after. And John, in his gospel, is revealing this scene to us in part just to show the setup of what's about to take place, of how it actually happened. But another reason that John is revealing this aspect of the story to us, he didn't have to. He could have just said Jesus was arrested and then move on. But the reason that John is trying to tell us this part of the story is to show the sovereign divine control that God has over the situation. What we as Christians would look at as a horrific situation, as evil winning in this moment, and in part that is what's going on in this one single element. And yet John wants to reassure us in the midst of this situation that when it looks like everything is lost, that God still has a plan, that he is still in control. We may not understand what he's doing in the moment. We may not be able to comprehend it, but we can take great rest and great faith in the knowledge that God's in control. It's something you can take great faith in today wherever you are. Whatever situation or circumstance that you're in. It may not be something that you asked for. It may not be something that you desired. It might be a direction in your life that you didn't expect it to take. It might be a tremendous grief, a tremendous sorrow. It might feel as though evil is winning, and it might be the consequences of evil in this moment, either of your own decision-making or the decision-making of somebody else, or just the consequences of being fallen people in the midst of a fallen world. We all experience evil. And yet what the gospel is beginning to tell us here is we can have this hope, this trust, that God is still in control, that he's still in charge, that there is still a path and a plan and a pattern of what is going on. And so in faith, we can walk with him. In faith, we can sing in much the same way, "It is well with my soul," even if we don't understand what's taking place in our lives right now. Even if we are overwhelmed by the grief and the sorrow of loss, or overwhelmed by the shame that's going on, we can, in the midst of it, still have faith and follow him and obey him. What's so fascinating about this story, especially whenever it comes to Mother's Day, is that it doesn't end right there. We would expect it to. We would expect it to end right there with now the arrest of Jesus. But John goes on to tell a little story about Peter. And apparently Peter in this moment was illegally concealed carrying. You see, it wasn't legal during the Passover week, the Passover celebration, when everybody was in town. It wasn't legal to have a weapon on you. You couldn't do it. Now, the rest of the time you probably could, but during this season you couldn't. You were supposed to leave your weapons at home. And so Peter, apparently maybe not necessarily caring about what the laws necessarily were, Peter, he didn't have his long sword on him. He just had his travel knife, right? And it was underneath his outer coat. Well, as they're coming to arrest Jesus, and Jesus showing this calmness, this boldness. Remember in John 17, we had seen Jesus, this victorious one, now praying as this great overcomer, not cowering in fear, but instead ready to face what was before him. And Peter pulls his knife and goes after one of the soldiers and cuts his ear off. Why? Why was he doing that in this moment? What is it that was taking place that would cause him to do this? Is it possible that what was happening in this moment is that Peter was trying to show off his faith? Remember, Jesus had said, "You're going to deny me." Jesus had said that 3 times this is going to happen, and Peter thought there's no way this is going to take place. Is it possible that Peter in this moment wanted to show Jesus, "You got me wrong. I'm going to show I'm willing to stand with you"? And it is a great amount of faith. Think about the faith that Peter had here in this moment. Remember, Judas had looked at the way the tides were turning and looked at the message of Jesus and the message of love and compared it to the message of the Romans and the message of the Jewish leaders, that change comes through power and manipulation and position. And he looked at the message of Jesus, that it came through a table and a towel and service and love. And Judas could see this is a feel-good message that might be good in the moment, but it's not going to overthrow the Roman government. And so Judas probably thought to himself, there's no way Jesus can win, so I'm going to switch side and now be with the Romans. Peter in this moment had enough faith to think to himself that as long as Jesus is on my side, me and this sword can take down the Romans. That's tremendous faith. But it wasn't God's plan. It wasn't the plan of God in any way. And what Peter was doing in this moment was choosing the way of the world. Remember, we said that the second half of John's Gospel, it begins in chapter 13 and goes through chapter 21. And we said in that moment that the story of the washing of the disciples' feet was an introductory story to the rest of the book. That John was showing us the way of Jesus, that so contrasted with the world, that this message of love, that is the way the world is ultimately changed. That is the kingdom ethic of the kingdom of God, that he is going to reject position and power and force and manipulation, and he is going to go the way of the table and the towel. And so Peter in this moment, while having a great deal of faith that as long as I got Jesus on my side, we can win, he chose a way that contradicted God's way. It didn't match up. It might have matched up with his common sense, but it didn't match up with kingdom sense. And he chose the way of power. And that's the way that Jesus had rejected. Jesus didn't want to go the way of the sword. Jesus wanted to go the way of love. And Peter in that moment revealed that he still wasn't getting it. Well, we don't get it either, do we? We don't get it either. We hear the message of love. We hear the message of table and towel, of service, that this is the way that the world will truly be changed, that this is what the kingdom is all about. But we're still so tempted to go the way of the sword, to go the way of the force. And if we're not very careful, we can actually baptize this worldly way and think to ourselves, as long as we're doing it in the name of God, as long as we're going God's way, as long as we have Jesus on our side, that he will then bless our sword. That's not how it works. And Jesus turns to Peter and he says, put your sword up. And then he asks the question, am I not to drink the cup that is before me? Is this not mine to drink? Do you not want me to do this, Peter? Do you not trust me in this moment? Do you not think that I know the way that I'm going? Do you think in this moment that you have a better way? Do you truly want to put yourself above me in this moment, Peter? And the answer is obviously no. The answer is obviously, Jesus, you have the way. You know the way. And yet it's so difficult in the moment to truly trust. Now, what does this have to do with Mother's Day? If we look at this text and just take a step back from it and begin to look at this day of Mother's Day, what's the relationship that's here? I have a simple question for you today, especially for moms, but then it overflows to the rest of us. Do you have enough faith to allow those that you love to walk the road God has planned for them? Do you have enough faith to allow those that you love to walk the road that God has planned for them? Or is it possible that there are times in which you're tempted to say, God, I don't like your plan. I don't like what you're doing here. I don't trust you. Or I can see what's going on here and it's not going to be for their best, and so I now want to step in. I want to now overstep my bounds and just try to help your plan out a little bit. You know what I think Peter the disciple is? I think in many ways he's a first century mama. Full of faith. And yet if you're not very careful, maybe not having fully understand the method and the message of Jesus, with very good intentions, will step over the proper boundaries. Tell me this isn't like a mama. Tell me Peter cutting off. Now Jesus came in and healed the guy. We don't fully know what that means, but Jesus healed the guy. And how did that not cause everybody to bow down and worship in that moment? We don't know. But tell me this doesn't sound like a softball mama when the coach has made some questionable playing time conditions. She's concealed carrying, and nobody knows it until all of a sudden she's been crossed and her child's been hurt. Do you notice Peter's mistake here? Do you notice what he's done? Full of faith, he has misunderstood the message of God. But then full of faith, he has overstepped his role. He refused to show any kind of holy restraint and to say, you know what? That's not my call. That's their call. That's his responsibility. I trust Jesus in this moment to take care of himself. Oh, how difficult it must be. How difficult it must be, whether it begins in pregnancy and you feel that kick in the stomach and all the excitement and all of the fear, and it feels like in that moment so much of the weight of the world is on your shoulders because the well-being of the baby is completely up to you. And you become this incubator for 9 months and you deliver in this miraculously extraordinary event. And then the baby is still completely under your control, and its well-being is completely up to you. Or if it didn't happen in that way, whenever the adoption occurs, you understand the trauma that was in the past in this child, and you weren't able in those moments to step in and rescue. But now in these moments, you almost had to have this desire to redeem what was in the past and protect what's going on in the future. And whenever you become a mama, you take this weight of the world that's on your shoulders, and it feels almost like you're a god to this child. But unbeknownst to you, what's happening from the very moment of conception, from the very moment of adoption, is as that child develops, there is a natural process that is taking place that will ultimately lead to that child breaking away from you, to be its own person, to make its own choices. And what a difficult process that is. You feel it. You feel the pain of it the first time you take them to preschool. You feel the pain of it whenever you drop them off in kindergarten and first grade. You feel the pain of it in the midst of the sixth grade celebration party. You feel the pain of it in the first day of seventh grade. You feel the pain of it as you hand them the car keys for the first time. You feel the pain of it as they're walking across the stage in high school graduation. You feel the pain of it as they're going on off to college. You feel the pain of that break, of that separation. And yet how difficult it must be to have that feeling like everything is on me. How difficult it must be to restrain yourself and not on occasion to overstep your bounds. What God has rightly called you to be in their life, their mama, how difficult it must be not to overstep those bounds and try at times to play the role of the Holy Spirit, to try to usurp their decision-making process and to make it for them. To just every now and then, when you don't like the path that they're going down, to pull out your sword and do some damage. And yet I think this story reveals to us something that's very, very important. Even with good intentions, anytime we overstep our God-given boundaries, the result is destruction. The result is chaos. The result is pain. And how easy it is of me to stand up on this stage and to tell mamas that sometimes you need to have some holy restraint. That you need to recognize and to understand God's call upon your life, and what it is exactly your role within the life of your child. What it is your role is exactly within the life of your community, that God has gifted you with unique gifts, unique callings, and you're supposed to expend your energy in every way that you can to do the best that you can to help, support, and love, to create a community for children to grow up in, for families to flourish, for communities to flourish. And yet at the same time, the danger that you have is possibly overstepping. And there's a lot of mamas in this room with good intentions that you're overstepping. And you're enabling poor behavior from your kids or your friends or your loved ones. Because you just don't quite have the faith to say God knows what He's doing with them. And it's well intended. You can see the path that your child is headed down. You can see the path that your loved one is headed down in this moment. And you know that there's a better way. You want them to make better decisions. It's not that you trust God. It's not that you doubt God. It's that you doubt them. And you're trying to assist them. And yet it's not your role. Your role is to model and to encourage and to love. And depending on what age they are, to advise, to oversee. Little kids you can protect, yes, but as they get older, there are times in which you have to empower them to make even wrong decisions and to step back and to watch and to trust God. It's so easy, I think, in part, to stand on the stage and to dedicate your child to God in this moment in which you have total control. Now, I think in part we shouldn't do baby dedications when they're babies. We should do baby dedication when they're 15. Because in that moment, do you truly trust them to God? Where your influence and your decision-making process is getting less and less, and their freedom and their ability to make their own choices is getting more and more. In that moment, do you trust them? And let's be honest for a moment. This ain't just a mama issue. This is an issue for all of us. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not calling for passivity. The last thing this world needs is more passive people. The last thing that we need to do is throw our hands up and just say, it doesn't matter what we do, and so we're just going to trust them to the Lord, and in trusting them to the Lord, we neglect our responsibility. We neglect what we're supposed to do to raise them. I'm not calling us toward passivity. But notice if good parenting, if good motherhood, good fatherhood, if good citizenship, if good personhood is right in the middle, if that's where God's truth is found, you can swing the pendulum too far one way, and you're passive, and that's sinful. But you can also swing it too far the other way, where you're overly aggressive, where you're stepping over your bounds, and in so doing, that's equally sinful. In neither way are you expending yourself in great trust of God, worried about what you're supposed to do, worried about what you're supposed to take care of, your responsibility, and yet in the end, trusting everything to Him. You know, we look at this story and we think, oh, Peter, what are you doing? What are you doing here? Do you not understand? He's been telling you for weeks that this is about to take place. He spent basically the last 24 hours giving you a farewell address. We look at Peter here and go, Peter, because we know the rest of the story, because we know exactly what God is going to do, we know that Peter is fighting a battle here that he actually doesn't want to win. Think about it. If Peter wins in this moment, if he gets his way, if he can negate the way of Jesus away from the cross, he might win in the moment, but he will ultimately lose the battle. Because Peter needs Jesus to die for his sins. How true it is that so often we are fighting battles that even if we win, we lose. And it takes a great deal of faith in the midst of rejecting passivity to show a holy restraint and to say, God, what is my role here? If we could speak to Peter in this passage, we would look at it and say, Peter, you're so clueless. Why can't you just stand there and trust God? We can say that because we know the rest of the story. But think about this morning. If Peter in heaven can look down upon us, what would he be saying to us this morning? Oh, people, just trust God. Just trust God. Trust God with your children. Do your part, play your role, but don't overstep, and understand that if you overstep, that's to their detriment. Reject passivity, but also reject aggression, and have kind of a holy restraint in how it is that you parent. Trust them, because God knows what He's doing. It's better for that child to be in God's hands than your hands. How quickly He would look down upon us and say, trust Him. Trust Him in the midst of pregnancy, in the midst of trying to get pregnant. Trust Him in the midst of the adoption process, in the midst of the fostering process. Trust Him. Trust Him. Yes, understand the pain, admit the grief, but step into it. But trust Him in the midst of it. Don't recoil from it. Don't cause you to think that God doesn't love you now in some way because your life has taken a direction that you didn't expect. In the midst of it, step up and trust Him. Trust Him even as your child goes astray. As they're trying to find their ways, they're trying to figure out their ways in life. And yes, play your part and play your role, but also sometimes stand back. Trust Him in the midst of a diagnosis, in the midst of work situations. If Peter were to look at us today, he would simply say, why don't y'all just trust Him? Hasn't He proven Himself faithful all throughout the years? I don't know where you are today. I don't know what this text means to you. But do you have the faith to drink the cup that God has placed before you? In some circumstances, it's a cup we did not want to drink. It's a situation in life that we're going through right now that we simply have to endure. Do you have the faith to endure? And then specifically for moms, but for all of us. Do you have the faith to allow those that you love to walk the road that God has chosen for them? And in the midst of a holy restraint, to watch what God does, refusing to overstep your bounds, and instead trusting him in what he's going to do. Would you bow your heads in prayer with me? I wonder today. I wonder in what circumstance today you're being too passive, too apathetic. And what God is calling you to in this moment is to not deny him, but instead to have the courage to stand up and to show faith. But then I equally wonder today, what circumstances are you being overly aggressive? Where your call on your life at this moment is to allow God to do with other people what it is that he wants to do. And yet because you don't like the direction it's headed, you're pulling your sword and you're causing even more damage. Maybe it's at home. Maybe it's at work. Maybe it's in your own life and the lives of others. What Jesus is inviting you into to this day is the way of faith.